So, today we're going to dive into the historical narrative presented in the source text, A History of Palestine and the Israeli Occupation. Our goal here is to walk through the key events and arguments it puts forward, just to get a clear understanding of its specific take on this really complex history. And that really is the central question, isn't it? This is what frames the entire analysis in our source material. How did a place with such a long history of different communities living side by side, how did it become one of the most difficult conflicts in the world? Let's dig into the story it tells. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll set the scene and look at Palestine before 1900. Then, we'll get into the arrival of Zionism and the British Mandate. After that, we'll cover the huge turning point of 1948, the Nakba, and then the decades of occupation that followed. And we'll wrap up by looking at how the source tries to reframe some common narratives you might have heard. All right, let's jump right in with our first section, Palestine before the year 1900. The source really argues that to get a handle on the conflict, you first have to see what the region was actually like before everything started, especially during that long stretch under Ottoman rule. For more than 400 years, Palestine was a part of the Ottoman Empire, and the source drills down on this period for a key reason. The modern idea of a nation-state just wasn't a thing there yet. It was this multi-ethnic, multi-religious province where all these different communities had lived together for centuries. So let's put some numbers to that, because this is pretty fascinating. Back then, out of around 600,000 people, most were Sunni Muslims. But you also had these significant minorities. About 10% were Palestinian Christians, and there was a community of about 25,000 Palestinian Jews who had been there for a very, very long time. And the main point this source makes is that, by and large, things between these groups were pretty stable and peaceful. Okay, so now we get to the part where everything starts to change. The Ottoman Empire collapses after World War I, the British step in, and a brand new political movement that started in Europe turns its attention squarely on Palestine. So what exactly is political Zionism? Well, according to this source, it's defined very specifically as a political movement born in Europe near the end of the 1800s with a single main goal: to create a nation-state with a Jewish majority in Palestine. And the text points out that the biggest challenge to that goal was pretty obvious. Palestine was already home to hundreds of thousands of people. And to really drive this point home, the source points to this quote from Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was a really influential early Zionist leader. It's presented as proof of how the movement's own founders talked about their project. The author uses this to argue that right from the get-go, the movement knew that force was going to be absolutely essential for it to succeed. And this is where, according to the source, a huge player enters the scene: the British Empire. In 1917, the British government issues something called the Balfour Declaration. It basically promises support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. The author argues that this backing from an empire was the absolute game changer, the golden ticket that let the Zionist movement get a real foothold and grow. All right, so now we're arriving at what the source presents as the pivotal moment in this entire story: the UN partition plan in 1947 and the war that came right after it in 1948. This is the event that Palestinians called the Nakba, which translates to the catastrophe. Okay, take a look at these numbers, because this is the core of the UN's recommendation, and the source really highlights what it sees as a major imbalance here. The plan suggested giving 56% of the land to a Jewish state, even though the Jewish population at the time was only about a third of the total and, according to the text, owned just 5 or 6% of the land. Unsurprisingly, Palestinian leaders rejected this plan. So publicly, the Zionist leadership said yes to the plan. But the author then brings up this quote from David Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister, to show what was being said behind closed doors. The argument here is that accepting partition was just a short-term move, a strategic step towards the bigger goal of eventually controlling all of Palestine. So the question is, how did this expansion actually happen on the ground? Well, the source points to a military strategy known as Plan D. And it's presented here not as a defense plan, but as an offensive one that was put in motion before the war with neighboring Arab countries officially started. Its objective, according to the author, was to grab land beyond what the UN had proposed and to systematically empty out Palestinian villages through force and expulsion. And this number is what it all led to, according to the source. This is the human cost. By the end of the war, around 800,000 Palestinians had been forced out of their homes, from over 500 different towns and villages. This is the event that is the Nakba. So, the 1948 war ends, but the conflict, it's far from over. This next section looks at what came next, what the author frames as decades of ongoing occupation and all the consequences that came with it. This timeline just gives us a quick flyby of the next few decades. In 67, Israel occupies the rest of the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza. And this new reality of military occupation, the source says, creates this cycle of popular uprisings, which were called intifadas, followed by peace talks like the Oslo Accords, which, in the end, didn't lead to a Palestinian state. Now, the Oslo Accords are a name you hear a lot, but the source argues we need to look at the fine print, how the West Bank was actually carved up. The new Palestinian Authority got full control over just 18% of the land. That's Area A. The huge majority of it, 61%, called Area C, stayed under complete Israeli control. The author argues that this fragmentation basically made a real, functioning Palestinian state impossible right from the start. All right, so for this last part, we're shifting gears a little. The source doesn't just want to tell a story. It wants to directly challenge a few common narratives, or what it calls myths, about how this all started. First up, this is a big one. The idea that the United Nations just created the State of Israel with a legal vote. It's a cornerstone of the story a lot of us learned. But what does the source have to say about it? So here's the counter-argument the source lays out, piece by piece. First, it claims that the UN vote in 1947 was just a recommendation. It wasn't legally binding. It argues the UN Charter didn't give it the power to slice up a country against the will of the people living there, and the Security Council never even agreed on how to do it. So the source's conclusion is that Israel wasn't created by international law, but by facts on the ground created by military force. Okay, here's another one you've probably heard. The narrative that Palestinians lost their land mainly because they just sold it off to Zionist organizations before 1948. This chart just lays out the numbers presented in the source to push back on that idea. You can see here that by 1948, even after decades of efforts to buy up land, Zionist groups had only managed to purchase about 6% of Mandate Palestine. The other 94% was still either in Palestinian hands or was public land. And the author really lands their argument with this pretty stunning quote, which comes from inside the Israeli government itself. After the 1967 war, an Israeli minister named Mordechai Bentov is quoted saying that the whole story about facing extermination was exaggerated after the war as a way to justify taking over more land. This quote is used to kind of sum up the source's entire thesis. So that leaves us with this final, really challenging thought. This whole explainer, by looking closely at this one source, has been about re-examining a story we think we know, but from a totally different angle. It asks us to think, what happens to our understanding of history when we shift our focus and really listen to the side of the story that, as this author argues, has so often been pushed aside?